You have read the Bible. You've heard of Adam, of Moses, of Israel, of the covenant. But there is a part that has been torn from that book, not by knife or scissors, but by silence. Not lost in war, but excluded in council. And maybe it was never handed to you. Have you ever wondered, why do nearly all the biblical figures in paintings, films, churches appear to be white? Why does the journey from Eden to Egypt, to the covenant, to the cross feel like a chain of Europeanization? Why is Moses, mistaken for an Egyptian, depicted as a Northern European man? And more importantly, if you are black, where are you on that covenant map? The truth is, you were never missing. You were just cut out of the manuscript. And one of the books that once preserved that map is the Book of Jubilees. In that book, the descendants of Ham were not cursed. They were given the southern lands, Cush, Ethiopia, Egypt, the sacred region. In that book, Adam kept the law. The Sabbath didn't wait for Sinai. The covenant wasn't made solely with Israel, but with all of humanity, according to lineage and allotted territory. And Africans were among the first to hold a portion of that covenant from the very beginning. The Book of Jubilees doesn't repeat Genesis, it restores it. It doesn't oppose Scripture, it fills in what's missing, and perhaps that's why it was removed. You've studied the Bible, but the part meant for you was hidden. Now is the time to reopen it, not to divide, but to return, not to rebel, but to reclaim your place in the promise once torn from your ancestors' hands. There was a book once delivered at the same time as the Law of Moses, a book that Jewish tradition calls the Book of the Angel, because it was the angel of God who recounted the entire sacred history, not just by events, but according to the timeline of the covenant, by each week, each Sabbath year, each Jubilee cycle. That book is called Jubilees, but you won't find it in the Western Bible because it was removed, not for being false, not for bad theology, but because it was inconvenient. Jubilees declares that the law existed since Adam. The Sabbath didn't begin with Exodus. Abraham kept ritual laws from sacrifice to circumcision before the Torah was ever given. The book lists in detail the land division among Noah's 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and makes it clear Cush, Ethiopia, Egypt, all were territories assigned to Ham's lineage, not cursed, not rejected, but explicitly marked out on the covenant map. Most striking of all, this book has been preserved in full, not in Rome, not in Europe, but in Ethiopia. One of the oldest communities of faith kept it without the approval of any council. Ethiopia didn't wait for the Vatican's confirmation. They didn't wait for European scholars' analysis. They simply held the book, because deep down they knew they are part of the sacred promise. Jubilees is the hidden map, the sacred calendar stripped from the official timeline. The proof that black people were not just background characters in the Bible, but lawkeepers, landholders, bearers of the light from the beginning. And if that book has endured for thousands of years through exile, war, colonization, maybe now is the time to reopen it, not to create a new religion, but to remember we were never excluded from the covenant. Someone just hid the book that said so. When we speak of Eden, we often think of a place, a garden bathed in light before sin entered. But the Book of Jubilees reveals that Eden is not merely a setting, but the beginning of a sacred chain of covenants where the law was not only present, but kept in full. Jubilees 3:15-17 states clearly, Adam and Eve lived in Eden for 7 years before the fall. During that time, they didn't just tend the garden, they kept the law. They honored the Sabbath, lived in the divine rhythm of the universe, discerned right from wrong, and learned to walk in the timeline of the covenant. That means the law didn't start with Moses. The law began in Eden. It didn't emerge from stone tablets in a desert, but from the first breath in the sacred garden. And within that flow, the descendants of Adam, including Ham, Cush, and generations of Africans, are direct heirs of a tradition that knew how to keep the law from the dawn of creation. Not outsiders, not latecomers, but the first to live by the covenant through their very lives. Eden was not a fairy tale dream. It was the opening chapter of living theology, where time, space, and humanity moved together in the rhythm of Sabbath, in the light, in the order of God. If you are a descendant of Ham, you carry more than skin color. You carry part of a memory that lived 7 years in Eden's light, a time without sin, without separation, without conquest, only the covenant kept like sacred breath. And the Book of Jubilees doesn't merely recall this as memory. It affirms Eden is the model, and you are part of that model, not beginning in Egypt, not beginning in exile, but beginning in the place where God walked among the garden, and humanity kept the rhythm of the light. That is a deeper origin than any nationality. That is the covenant lived, before there was even a people called Israel. And you may carry that beginning in your very blood. One of the most dangerous lies ever preached from a pulpit is the curse of Ham. That because Ham saw his father's nakedness, his descendants, namely black people, were cursed by God. That dark skin is a mark of punishment. That Africans were born to serve, to be enslaved, because they carried cursed blood. But the truth in the Book of Jubilees utterly destroys that toxic theology. Jubilees 8:10-19 says nothing about a racial curse. On the contrary, it describes in sacred detail a ceremony after the flood, where Noah divides the earth among his 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. No one was punished. No one was rejected. Each lineage was assigned their land as part of the covenant. Ham was given the entire southern region, from the Nile, the land of Cush, Ethiopia, Egypt, all the way down to southern Africa. A rich, abundant land, formally established by God as a rightful inheritance. Cush, Ham's son, was designated to rule that land, and the only punishment mentioned in Jubilees is for anyone who crosses into land that does not belong to them. That is why Canaan, Ham's son, was reprimanded, not because of his skin, not because of his bloodline, but because he encroached on territory meant for Shem. This was not a racial curse, but a violation of covenant boundaries. The truth is, Ham was not cursed. Cush was not cast out. Africans were not considered outsiders. On the contrary, they were the first to keep the land that was assigned. And in that tradition, land is not just property, but a sacred portion in a divine agreement with God. If you are African, the Book of Jubilees does not call you a slave. It calls you an heir, not a victim of consequence, but a recipient of inheritance. Not cursed, but theologically slandered. It's time to return the truth to those who were forced to believe their skin color was a mark of distance from God. Jubilees disagrees, and if you read it again, you'll never bow your head the same, because you are not cursed. You were chosen to keep the sacred land. Most of us were taught that the law, the commandments of God, only appeared in the time of Moses on Mount Sinai, that before then humanity lived naturally, without patterns, without divine order. But the Book of Jubilees completely shatters that view. In the Book of Jubilees, the law is not a reaction to sin, it is the very structure woven into the fabric of the universe. From Eden, from Adam, from a time even before Israel existed, the law has been the heartbeat of life itself. Adam, the first man, was not only created good, he was taught the law. He kept the Sabbath. He understood what was clean and unclean. He lived in Eden as a primordial priest, guarding the sacred order of the universe. No one forced him. His soul naturally moved in harmony with the rhythm of the law. Then came Noah. Long before the book of Leviticus, Noah already knew how to distinguish between offerings that were acceptable and those that were not. He upheld the sacred law before there was ever a people called Israel. After the great flood, during his offering, he presented only animals deemed clean. Jubilees 6. And he too kept the Sabbath, once again without waiting for Moses. Abraham, the father of faith, also kept the entire law. He offered Isaac as a proper sacrifice. He lived according to the holy cycles, understood the 7-year cycle, honored the feast seasons, and kept the law in its fullness, from circumcision to offerings, not because he was commanded, but because he knew God. Jubilees reveals this truth. The law is not a burden given to control. The law is memory. It is how humanity once lived in harmony with holiness. When Israel received the law at Sinai, they were not given something new. They were being reminded of what their forefathers once knew and had forgotten. And this means, if you are living according to the law today, returning to the Sabbath, eating according to the laws of clean and unclean, you are not converting to Judaism. You are remembering what once lived in your ancestors' blood. The Torah did not begin at Sinai. It began in the original light, and maybe it never left you. You only believed it wasn't meant for you. But the Book of Jubilees whispers something different. You are not learning the law. You are remembering. And when you remember, the law returns like a breath that was once forgotten. Time, in the vision of Jubilees, is not simply the passing of days. It is a sacred cycle, ordained by God as part of the covenant. Every day, every week, every year holds its place, its rhythm, and its meaning within a grander theology, where time, space, and divine law do not exist separately, but as one. Jubilees does not merely recount history, it reorders history by theological units. Every 7 days forms a week. Every 7 weeks, 49 days, leads to the Feast of Weeks, Pentecost. Every 7 years is a Sabbath cycle for the land. And every 7 cycles of 7 years marks the Jubilee, the sacred 50th year when everything returns to its rightful place. In the Jubilee year, the land rests. The lost inheritance is restored. Slaves are set free. Relationships are healed. This is not a social policy. It is how the universe is renewed. According to Jubilees, time is not neutral. It is the bloodstream of the covenant. You cannot keep the law if you are not living in right time. You cannot keep the land if you do not let the land rest according to its cycle. And you cannot dwell in holiness if you are not walking in the rhythm of sacred time. Jubilees shows us time is not something humans manage with clocks. It is a schedule written in light, beginning in Eden, divided by God, and when broken, it leads to disconnection from the covenant. That is why Jubilees records every historical event, not just by year, but by sacred week. Nothing is random. Everything happens within a cycle, and if you do not count it right, you cannot live it right. If you've ever felt like modern time makes you forget who you are, pushes you away from your origin, your rest, your inner covenant, then the Book of Jubilees is an invitation. Do not chase time. Return to the cycle of holiness. Because in the Jubilee year, it is not only the land that is restored, you are returned to your rightful place in the sacred map. We often think of sin as a wrong action, lying, stealing, killing, adultery. But in the Book of Jubilees, sin does not begin with action, but with a misalignment from sacred time. Sin, in the language of Jubilees, is when a soul steps out of the rhythm God has ordained. It is not only when people do wrong, it is when people forget the calendar, when they no longer count the Sabbath, no longer know when to stop, when to forgive, when to return. That is when the covenant begins to crack. When people no longer rest on the seventh day, they are not just breaking a command. They have lost the sacred clock, and when the clock is lost, they no longer know where they are in God's story. They may keep the law outwardly, offer sacrifices, perform rituals, but if they are out of cycle, they are out of covenant. And the most painful truth is this: Black Israelites, the descendants of those who were given land, once kept this rhythm. But when they were taken into exile, into slave ships, into systems that did not follow the Sabbath, did not follow Jubilee, they lost not only land, not only freedom, but the ability to count time correctly. This is a deeper kind of exile, exile from the breath of the covenant. The fall, according to Jubilees, is not only about eating forbidden fruit or breaking a command. It is losing direction in God's time, losing the ability to know what day it is, forgetting when to return, forgetting that after 7 sevens, there is a Jubilee year to restore all things. If you've ever felt your life has no rhythm, just spinning, exhausted, unsure if today has meaning, maybe you are living out of cycle, not because you are evil, but because you were disconnected from the sacred rhythm. Jubilees does not threaten punishment. It shows us how to rebuild the calendar, and it begins with one thing: remember the Sabbath. Remember that you once lived in a system with a rhythm of restoration. You don't need to change the world. Just live again one day, then 1 week, then 1 season. Sin is not only doing wrong, it is forgetting, and grace is remembering. Today, if you begin to count again, start with 1 rest day, 1 upward glance, 1 act in rhythm. You won't just live better. You will return to the covenantal identity that was once in your blood. History is not only changed by war or politics. It can also be rewritten by silence, by removing a book, by calling a text unorthodox. And when the Book of Jubilees was excluded from the Western Bible, we didn't just lose another narrative, we lost the original map. Because Jubilees doesn't just retell events, it redraws the map of land, time, and lineage according to the covenant. When Noah divided the earth after the flood, this book records in detail which territories were assigned to Shem, Ham, and Japheth, not based on ethnicity, but on sacred timing, moral order, and divine promise. Shem received West Asia, including Israel and Mesopotamia. Japheth received the north. And Ham, the ancestor of black people, was given the entire south, from Egypt to Cush to sub-Saharan lands, but when this book was removed from the canon, that information disappeared, and the result? The occupiers of Ham's land began to call African peoples pagans. They claimed Cush had no part in the covenant. They painted holy maps with only white figures, and land, instead of being a righteous inheritance, became a colonial prize. This did more than distort historical understanding. It created an identity crisis. The descendants of Ham, including millions of black people today, were severed from the covenant's origin. They didn't know they were named, didn't know their ancestral land had been ordained by God, didn't know their loss of land, Sabbath, and cycle was a sacred tragedy, not just a political one. Jubilees preserved that map, not just geographically, but theologically. No one invented Cush's rights. They were assigned, sanctified, and written down, and only when we read this book again can we redefine the boundaries, not only of land, but of the soul. You cannot live in the covenant if you don't know where your part lies on the map. And if you are of African descent, the Book of Jubilees may be the first map that tells you clearly, you were never lost. You were erased from the copy, but your portion still exists in the manuscript they didn't want you to read, and maybe it's time you opened it, not to wage political battle, but to reclaim the sacred identity your ancestors once held with all their soul. We've been taught to see land as property, something to buy, sell, trade, or conquer. But in the Book of Jubilees, land is not property. It is sacred. It is divided not by power, but by covenant, not by need, but by destiny. And each portion of land is a piece of the promise written by the hand of God. Jubilees chapter 8 describes how Noah, guided by God, divided the entire earth among his 3 sons. This was not a political move, but a theological ritual. Each portion of land was tied to bloodline, to soul, to the responsibility of upholding law and order in that territory. The portion of Cush, which includes Ethiopia, Sudan, Egypt, and the entirety of East and Central Africa, was established by God as the land belonging to the descendants of Ham, not as a secondary territory, not as a cursed place, but as a named and consecrated land. In that tradition, anyone who violates the assigned territory does not merely break a law, they violate the covenant. Canaan was dealt with, not because of his skin color, but because he seized the land of Shem. And any nation that invades, colonizes, or erases those sacred boundaries is considered a theological rebel. This completely changes how we view the history of Africa. Ethiopia is not just a nation, it is a covenant land. It preserved the Book of Jubilees, not for cultural reasons, but because the soul of that land had never been severed from the sacred calendar. When you see colonial maps, when you see black people displaced from ancestral lands, disconnected from the rhythms of life and their right to steward their territory, you are witnessing a breaking of the sacred covenant. It is not only a moral wrong, it is a violation of divine order established since the time of Noah. And if you are of African descent, the land beneath your feet today may have once belonged to the covenant, but not for ownership's sake, for stewardship, as one who preserves sacred order. Jubilees doesn't merely rewrite history, it reclaims the value of land. And when you understand that the land of Cush was set apart by God, you will no longer see yourself as late to the story of salvation. You and the land you walk upon may be carrying a sacred portion that was once forgotten. But the covenant has not forgotten. It remains, waiting for its steward, not through force, but through memory and awakening. For centuries, black people have been pushed to the margins of the biblical story, treated as side characters, or worse, as cursed in distorted interpretations. But the Book of Jubilees not only rejects that view, it clearly affirms that black Israelites were once identified as an essential part of the covenant. After the Great Flood, God, through the patriarch Noah, assigned land to the three lineages, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. This was not random, not a matter of power, but a deliberate theological division. And the portion of Ham, including Cush, Ethiopia, Egypt, and the entire south, was named with clarity. Jubilees chapter 8 leaves no room for doubt. Cush is not pagan. This lineage was given a sacred portion of land. It is not reduced. It is not footnoted as punished. There is no trace of a so-called black curse. On the contrary, they were the first entrusted to guard land under the covenant. And if the lineage of Cush was given land, then they were identified as within the covenant. Not merely neighbors of Israel, but holders of a piece of the covenantal map from the beginning. This truth shatters the exclusive image of Israel as a white or Middle Eastern-only chosen people. Because in the same division of the covenant, Israel, through Shem, and Cush, through Ham, both received portions, both were given laws, both lived within the sacred cycle. This means, if you are of African descent, you are not trying to enter the biblical story. You've been in it, since Noah, since the earth was still drying after the flood, since the covenant wasn't written in scrolls, but carved into the very land your ancestors once walked. You don't need to seek identity in others' eyes. Jubilees has already named you, not by your skin, but by your land, your law, and your faithfulness that was once entrusted to your lineage. And if the covenant still stands, then your portion of that map was never erased, only hidden. But theological truth, once read, can reignite what was once extinguished in the minds of a whole people, and you are part of that restoration. For too long, the curse of Ham has been used as a tool to justify slavery, racism, and the oppression of black people. For centuries, millions were taught that Ham's descendants, specifically Canaan, were cursed for an act of disrespect, and that black skin became a symbol of shame and subjugation. But that buried truth, Jubilees makes clear, never existed. In Jubilees chapter 10, Canaan is not cursed because of skin color, nor because his father Ham saw his father's nakedness as described in Genesis. Canaan is mentioned in an entirely different context. He deliberately seized land already assigned to Shem. When Noah divided the land under God's guidance, all boundaries were set as a sacred part of the covenant. No one was permitted to violate them, not even family. Canaan, instead of settling in the territory assigned to Ham's lineage, chose to dwell in the western region, the land that later became Israel, clearly given to Shem. Jubilees presents this not as Canaan's personal sin, but as a breach of a divine land covenant. His fault was not in bloodline, not in skin color, not in destiny, but in choosing to violate sacred boundaries set by God. There is not a single line about skin color, no concept of a black curse, no divine decree that black people were born to be subjugated. That entire theology of racial hierarchy is man-made, not God-ordained. The truth is, Ham and his sons, including Canaan, were all given land, lived under the law, and had responsibility to preserve their portion of the sacred map. Only when someone violated their boundary, trespassed the covenant, was there correction. That is what happened to Canaan. If we do not read Jubilees, we will continue to repeat distorted theology, where discrimination is disguised as a curse. But when truth is revealed, justice is restored. Canaan was not punished for being black. He was rebuked for stepping into land that was not his. And if the roots of discrimination began with a lie, then liberation begins with a sacred truth. Your skin has never been the reason you were excluded from the covenant. It never was. It was only mispreached. And Jubilees was the text bold enough to say that thousands of years ago. In most modern sermons, the lineage of Shem, the ancestor of Israel, is portrayed as the center of obedience, law-keeping, and covenant living. While the line of Ham, the ancestor of Africans, is overlooked, or worse, seen as rejected, living outside of grace. But when we open the Book of Jubilees, that picture changes completely. Jubilees tells us that after the flood, Noah did not only teach the law to Shem, he passed it on to all three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. That means Ham and all his descendants like Cush, Mizraim, Egypt, Put, Libya, were taught the same covenant, the same sacred calendar, the same Sabbath law. There was no distinction in faith. No spiritual privilege was withheld from any lineage. There was no concept of outsider in God's eyes when the law was passed down through bloodline, through parents, through the instruction of a father. When speaking of the Cushites, the peoples of Ethiopia, Sudan, and Africa, Jubilees does not portray them as distant from God. On the contrary, they were those who upheld their assigned territory, who lived in rhythm with Jubilee time, who kept the Sabbath, and who bore responsibility for maintaining the law in their governed region. Not inferior to Shem, not excluded, not needing to return, because they never left. The true theology of Jubilees is one of shared responsibility, where each lineage keeps its part of the covenant. And if Ham was given the south, then the task of his descendants was to preserve holiness there, to teach the law to their children, to keep the cycles, the land, and the promise. If you are a descendant of Cush, Mizraim, or Put, you do not need anyone's permission to enter the covenant. You were born into it. Your ancestors kept the law. They were not pagans. They were not lost. Only their story was cut out. And now, when you read Jubilees, you are not learning something new. You are remembering something ancient. You are restoring the memory of a lineage that was taught the law, not out of favoritism, but sacred responsibility. You, descendant of Ham, carry a sacred portion. And when you keep the law today, you are not imitating Israel. You are continuing the legacy of your African ancestors who once walked in covenant from the very beginning. Have you ever wondered, why is the Book of Jubilees, an ancient text preserved for thousands of years, not in the Bible of most of the Christian world? It is not in the Catholic Bible, nor in the Protestant. Yet it is fully preserved in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. Was it removed for theological error, or because it was too true? The truth is, Jubilees was not removed for heresy. On the contrary, it was removed because it was inconvenient for theological systems designed to serve power. Jubilees does three things that make traditional theology uncomfortable. It says the law began in Eden, not at Sinai. It redraws the sacred map, showing that land was divided among Shem, Ham, and Japheth, with no one cursed by skin and no inferior lands. And most importantly, it does not allow grace to erase law. It insists the covenant is not just about belief, but about living the cycle, keeping the law, preserving the land, and honoring the feasts. In an era when theology was being weaponized to justify empires and colonial rule, a book that boldly stated black people were not excluded from the covenant, but were landholders assigned by God, was dangerous. And so, the book was removed. Not because it contradicted the Bible, but because it filled in the parts theological councils wanted left blank. It does not oppose the Torah, but reminds us of the parts of Torah that were never preached. It does not reject grace, but refuses to let grace be used as a license to erase righteousness and covenant. Today, if you want to understand identity, understand the law, understand the sacred timeline, and why your ancestors once walked in the light, you must read Jubilees again. Because it is not just a forgotten text, it is a key to restore what was cut out. It is a voice once hidden, but now returning at the appointed time. And perhaps you are the one chosen to reopen it. Not to create another religion, but to complete a covenant from which a few pages were torn. And each of those pages was where your name was written from the very beginning. Not all truth is burned by fire. Not all scriptures are erased by sword and spear. Some sacred things, though excluded from canon, though never preached, though called apocryphal, have been preserved quietly, faithfully, across generations. The Book of Jubilees is one of those sacred things. It was not destroyed. It was not lost. It was simply hidden from the eyes of Western Bible readers. But in Ethiopia, a land untouched by the theological assimilation of European councils, that book is still read, not as a side text, but as a sacred part of the living covenant. Ethiopia did not preserve Jubilees for power. They preserved it out of faithfulness, because they understood that the words of the covenant were not written only by hand, but by memory. And there are memories which, if forgotten, cause the covenant itself to fracture. Because of that faithfulness, today we have the chance to read it again. Not to fuel theological arguments, not to start a new religion, but to restore what was once labeled heresy, only because it was too true, too complete, too dangerous to systems that needed a trimmed, convenient, and controllable Bible. Jubilees never disappeared. It was simply waiting for the right person to find it again. And if you are reading this, perhaps you are that person. Not because you've studied deeply, but because you still remember something no one taught you. You remember that the law is not a burden, that you were once called by name, that your ancestors did not begin as slaves, but as part of the covenant. Truth doesn't need marketing. It only needs one generation brave enough to believe again. And if today you reopen Jubilees, then that truth is no longer hidden. It comes alive within your soul. If you've ever felt like an outsider, merely invited into the biblical story, if you've ever been told you were a stranger, grafted in, or only allowed to benefit from grace but not to carry any sacred portion from the beginning, then let the Book of Jubilees say this to you. You are not a guest, you are an heir. From the moment God divided the earth among Noah's 3 sons, the name of Cush was spoken, not as a wilderness, not as a forgotten land, but as an official portion on the covenant map. You were not grafted into Israel's legacy. You were one of the original stewards of it. The covenant was never limited to the bloodline of Shem. For if only Shem kept the law, why would Jubilees clearly say that Adam, Noah, Abraham all kept the sacred law long before Moses? And if only Israel were chosen, why did God carefully assign land to Cush, to Mizraim, to Put, setting boundaries, laws, and responsibility on each lineage? The truth is, when you begin honoring the Sabbath again, returning to the law, guarding yourself from impurity, living in cycle, holding on to the faith, it is not converting to someone else's religion. You are stepping back into the rhythm that once belonged to your ancestors. No one has to give the covenant back to you because it was never taken. It was simply buried beneath layers of history, political theology, colonization, and spiritual whitewashing. But today, if you know what you're holding, then you don't need to belong. You already do. And that doesn't need to be proven with paperwork. It's engraved in the memory of the soul. You feel something rise within you when you hear about the law, about sacred cycles, about restoration. That is not just religious emotion, that is identity awakening. Jubilees does not merely record the past, it redefines you. And if you dare to keep what you once carried, then no one, no doctrine, no counsel can take the covenant from your hands, because you are not following a religion. You are living your portion. You don't need to start from scratch. If your lineage once kept the law, once walked in the covenant, once understood the Sabbath cycle and sacred timing, then you don't need to relearn everything as a stranger. You just need to remember. Every righteous action you choose today is not a new experiment. It is a sacred memory being awakened. Every time you keep the day of rest, you are not just resting, you are stepping again into the flow of your ancestors. Every time you speak a righteous word, you are not just choosing good, you are speaking again the language of your soul from before you were ever taught to forget. You don't need to climb a mountain. You don't need to find Eden. Eden was never lost. It's only covered in dust. And that dust is not outside. It lies in the very thought that you are a latecomer, the powerless, the unchosen. But when you awaken, when you reignite the old light in your soul, you live as though you were never forgotten. And the truth is, maybe you never truly forgot. You are simply reopening what once burned in your blood through generations who kept the law, guarded the land, and lived within the covenant. And now, you just need to step back in. No permission needed, because you were written into this story from the beginning. The covenant never died. It was not erased by history. Not choked by political theology, not fully forgotten, only dropped from the hands of those entrusted to guard it. But now it is being handed back, not through a prophet, not through a dream, but through the awakening of a generation willing to listen. Don't let this video be the end. Let it be a door into a new journey. Read the Book of Jubilees, not to gain more knowledge, but to restore sacred memory. Seek out the hidden texts, not to argue with others, but to find the piece of yourself that was erased from the printed pages of the Bible, and begin to ask, am I living in a sacred cycle or just repeating religious habit? Do I keep the law because I was named, or because I'm afraid of being excluded? Can I believe that the light my ancestors once kept is rising again in me? You don't need a revolution of doctrine. We've had enough theories. What the covenant waits for is a generation that knows how to live again what has been forgotten. Who knows when to rest for Sabbath? Who knows when to release in the 7th year? Who knows how to return land, return identity, return light, not only in word, but in daily action? If what you've heard today has stirred your soul, write something down. One action, one quiet decision, one small change you will keep from this week forward. No need to announce it. Just live it, as though you were never forgotten from the covenant. Because the truth is, you were never left out. You are simply stepping back into your portion, and the light will begin to shine again from where you stand when you dare to keep what was never meant to be lost. Amen.